Decades, St. Anselm's Church was the heart of its small, tight-knit town, the kind of place where everyone knew each other by name, and traditions ran deep. None was more beloved than the annual midnight mass on Christmas Eve, an event families looked forward to all year. The church, with its towering stained glass windows and heavy wooden pews, would glow with candlelight as parishioners gathered in solemn celebration. Carols echoed in the nave. Incense drifted lazily through the air, and children dressed in white robes assisted as altar servers while families watched with pride. It was magical, sacred, and for a long time, safe. That illusion shattered in 1987 when 9-year-old Daniel Whitaker failed to return home after serving as an altar boy during the Christmas Eve service. His parents, seated in the fifth pew, had watched him perform his duties near the altar with reverence and joy. After the final hymn, the congregation filed out into the frosty air, exchanging blessings and laughter. Daniel was supposed to join them in the vestibule before heading home. He never showed up. At first, no one panicked. It was assumed he had wandered off with friends or gotten caught up in the bustle of the parish festivities. But when Daniel didn't appear at home within an hour, his parents contacted the police. A search was launched within the church and surrounding grounds. Volunteers, friends, and officers combed nearby fields, back alleys, and wooded areas. The river that ran along the edge of town was dragged, but there was no sign of Daniel. No coat, no shoes, no body, nothing. The community was shocked. Children didn't just disappear from midnight mass. It was supposed to be the safest, holiest night of the year. Rumors swirled. Had Daniel run away? Been kidnapped? Was he hiding in the church? But even after days of investigation, no evidence emerged. The only certainty was that a child had vanished during one of the most public, closely watched events of the year, and no one had seen a thing. Authorities eventually suggested that Daniel may have wandered off and succumbed to the cold, but even that explanation didn't sit right. There was no body, and Daniel wasn't the type to run off. His family insisted he had been excited to serve Mass and had made plans for opening gifts the next morning. The town mourned. A plaque was added to the altar steps in Daniel's memory. But as months passed, people tried to move on, writing it off as a tragic fluke, until it happened again. In 1989, 2 years later, another child, 11-year-old, Maria Alvarez, went missing after midnight mass. She had been helping with candle lighting. Just like Daniel, she was last seen near the altar. Just like Daniel, she never made it out of the church. Now people were scared. Maria's disappearance brought back painful memories. And this time it was harder to explain away. Again, the search yielded nothing. There were no signs of forced entry, no signs of struggle. Church security was minimal. The building was always left unlocked on Christmas Eve so people could come and pray throughout the night. But how could two children disappear, unnoticed from the same sacred space, 2 years apart? Still, the authorities urged caution. Coincidence, they called it. There's no evidence of a link, they said. By the time child number 3 vanished in 1990, panic set in, and rightfully so. Thomas Griggs, age 10, disappeared while helping distribute programs to parishioners at the side entrance. His parents were steps away. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. The townspeople began whispering of something darker. Theories flew like crows over a graveyard. Some blamed satanic cults. Others pointed to the clergy. A few murmured that the church itself, or something within it, was cursed. But no matter how wild the theory, they all came back to one chilling truth. The children only disappeared during midnight mass. What once was a holy night had now become a date of dread. Yet despite the fear, people continued to attend. It was tradition, after all, and hope dies slowly in places built on faith. Parents gripped their children tighter, walked them to and from the altar, and kept them within sight at all times. But still, the disappearances continued. By 1992, a total of 11 children had vanished on or around Christmas Eve. Each one had a direct role in the midnight mass service. Altar boys, choir members, candle bearers, bulletin distributors. They were always trusted, always close to the clergy or in secluded areas of the church, always just out of sight when it happened. And still no evidence, no bodies, no witnesses. The tragedy stained the reputation of St. Anselm's forever. By the mid-90s, attendance at midnight mass had plummeted. People had lost trust not just in the church, but in the very idea that faith could protect them. Parents refused to let their children participate. Some families left town altogether. Those who remained kept secrets, feared shadows, and looked at their neighbors with suspicion. The disappearances became folklore, then urban legend. But to the families of the missing, they were very real. Christmas became a time of mourning, not a celebration. Every year, local papers would print memorials with faded photographs of the lost children, angelic smiles, frozen in time, beneath headlines like, "Still no answers and another Christmas without closure." And so, what began as a cherished annual tradition, a sacred ritual honoring peace, joy, and new beginnings, became the backdrop to one of the most unsettling, unsolved series of child disappearances in modern history. The question remains, how did 11 children vanish from the same church on the same night, over multiple years without a single trace? And more haunting still, why has no one been held accountable? When Daniel Whitaker vanished in 1987, most people in the town were willing to believe it was a horrible accident, a freak event, an innocent boy lost in the cold, or perhaps abducted by a stranger in an unplanned, opportunistic act. The grief was deep, but it came with the comfort of presumed normalcy. That comfort, however, began to fracture just 2 years later, and then it shattered completely. In 1989, when Maria Alvarez, an 11-year-old choir singer, disappeared under nearly identical circumstances, things no longer looked like coincidence. She had been standing near the side chapel helping with candle lighting during the midnight mass ceremony. Her parents were sitting just rows away, beaming with pride. As the mass drew to a close, Maria was expected to rejoin them and walk home for their traditional midnight cocoa, present opening, but Maria never arrived. She was last seen exiting the side chapel with a basket of extinguished candles. That was it. After that, she was simply gone. People began to ask hard questions. How could this happen twice? Both children disappeared within the same church, during the same event, and under the same conditions. During the midnight mass, in proximity to church leadership and fellow parishioners, and with no witnesses. The more detail emerged, the eerier it became. The pattern was not just strange, it was almost surgical in how consistent and undetectable it was. And then it happened again. In 1990, Thomas Griggs, age 10, went missing after greeting congregants at the main entrance. His role was simple: hand out programs, smile politely, and then join his family in the pews. But somewhere between his last program and the start of the Mass, Thomas vanished. His parents had been just a few feet away, distracted by conversation and the start of the service. When they turned to beckon him inside, he wasn't there. They assumed he'd gone to the restroom or wandered toward the altar, but as time passed and he didn't return, panic set in. When authorities reviewed the situation, they again found no signs of a struggle, no forced entry or exit, and most importantly, no one had seen anything suspicious. This time, the town couldn't pretend anymore. 3 children, 3 years, 1 location. The police were hesitant to admit a connection, but the families knew better. The midnight mass disappearances were now a pattern. A dark tradition had emerged, each year tainting the holiest night of the town's calendar with fresh heartbreak. The next year, 1991, brought 2 more vanishings, a horrifying escalation. Samantha Reeves, 12, and Aaron Lim, 9, were both altar servers for that year's midnight mass. They had rehearsed together for weeks, learning the liturgy, preparing the chalice, and walking the route from sacristy to altar. Their parents watched proudly as they assisted in the mass, unaware that this would be the last time they would ever see their children alive. After the service, as the congregation filtered out into the snowy streets, Samantha and Aaron didn't rejoin their families. At first, no one panicked. They were thought to be helping clean up in the back. But when the parents searched the sacristy, the storage rooms, even the priest's quarters, the children were nowhere to be found. 2 children gone in one night, in a building packed with people, in what should be one of the most watched, supervised nights of the year. It was now undeniable. Someone, or something, was targeting the children involved in midnight mass. The town descended into fear. The police were under enormous pressure, yet they had no leads. There were no fingerprints, no security footage, no blood. The children seemed to vanish without resistance or trace, like shadows dissolving in candlelight. From that year on, the disappearances took on a chilling rhythm. 1992, Nicholas Tran, age 8, disappeared while bringing the nativity figurines to the altar before the service began. 1993, Jessica Maureen, 11, a member of the children's choir, vanished during the post-mass caroling in the foyer. 1994, Brandon Ellis, 10, assigned to assist with incense during the final procession, disappeared before the closing hymn. 1995, Kayla and Jeremy Duncan, siblings ages 9 and 12. They lit the Advent wreath together, then vanished before communion. That brought the total to 11 missing children over 9 years, all during the same annual event, all involved in official church duties, and all gone without a trace. Parents became terrified to let their children participate. Some even pulled their kids out of the church completely. Christmas, once a time of joy and community, became a season of fear and paranoia. Midnight mass attendance dropped dramatically. Where once there were standing room only crowds, now only a few dozen brave or desperate attendees showed up, often without their children. Despite the panic, there were no arrests, no suspects, and no public theories from law enforcement. The case files grew thicker, but the answers didn't come. One of the eeriest parts of the mystery was how perfectly timed each disappearance was. In every case, the children went missing during natural breaks in the service, just before a procession, during candle collection, while moving between rooms, or while assisting priests behind the altar. It was as if someone knew the liturgy intimately, someone who could predict when a child might be alone or unwatched for just a moment. This led to dark speculation about whether someone inside the church was responsible. But those whispers rarely left the shadows. The church held enormous power in the town. Suggesting that a priest, sacristan, or choir director might be involved was nearly unthinkable at the time. Some families tried, only to be met with legal threats or social ostracism. The church continued to maintain its innocence, calling the events tragedies beyond comprehension. and stating that no evidence pointed to an internal threat. But the coincidences were too many, the timing too precise, the silence too deep. And with each passing year, the question grew more impossible to ignore. How does someone take a child, let alone 11, from a crowded church on the same night, again and again, and no one sees a thing? By the end of 1995, the town no longer celebrated Christmas like it once had. Midnight Mass was effectively canceled the following year, replaced with a modest morning service held under tight supervision. But the damage had been done. The disappearances had not only claimed 11 children, they had claimed the spirit of a community, and the nightmare was far from over. In most missing child cases, time is everything. The first 48 hours are critical. The sooner patterns are recognized, the faster law enforcement can act. But what happens when those patterns point somewhere no one wants to look, somewhere trusted, even sacred? That's what happened in the small town surrounding St. Anselm's Church, where over the course of 6 years, 11 children disappeared, all during midnight mass on or around Christmas Eve. And yet somehow the alarming connections between the cases went unacknowledged, or worse, deliberately ignored. The first disappearance, that of Daniel Whitaker in 1987, was treated as a tragic anomaly. Police assumed he had wandered off, gotten lost, or fallen victim to an opportunistic predator. The investigation turned up nothing, but the explanation, thin as it was, let the community breathe. They didn't want to believe something sinister had entered their lives, and they certainly didn't want to believe it had entered their church. But when Maria Alvarez disappeared 2 years later, also from St. Anselm's, and also during midnight mass, it should have triggered alarm bells. Instead, officials repeated the same script. Tragic, inexplicable, isolated. They dismissed community concerns, assuring families there was no evidence linking the cases. Then came Thomas Griggs. By this third disappearance, fear and outrage began to simmer. All 3 missing children had been directly involved in church duties. All 3 had disappeared inside or just outside of the church building, and all 3 had been last seen moments before or after participating in midnight mass. A few local journalists tried to connect the dots. One writer, Janice Meller, published a column titled, "3 Kids, 1 Church, Coincidence or Cover-Up?" The article outlined the timeline, similarities in the children's roles, and the church's conspicuous lack of transparency. But the piece was quickly buried. The paper issued a half-hearted apology for fostering conspiracy theories, and Meller was reassigned to the lifestyle section. Behind closed doors, families began having private meetings, comparing notes. What they found was chilling. All of the children were between the ages of 9 and 12. All were active members of the church with roles in the midnight mass. Most were last seen either near the sacristy, the altar, or backstage corridors. In at least 5 cases, their last known interaction was with a member of the church staff. Still, police wouldn't publicly call it a pattern. To do so would mean admitting they had missed something big. Worse, it might implicate people within the church, an institution that held enormous influence over local politics, donations, and law enforcement. For many in power, it was easier to deny than to confront. Privately, some officers admitted to sensing something wasn't right. One retired detective, speaking years later under anonymity, said, "After the 4th kid, we knew something connected them, but nobody wanted to be the one to say it out loud. Not in a town like this. Not with that church." And so the silence continued, even as more children vanished. The disappearances followed a strangely consistent pattern. There were no signs of forced entry or struggle. Surveillance cameras were mysteriously malfunctioning or non-existent. Witnesses always said the same thing. We saw them a minute ago, and then they were gone. No fingerprints, no footprints, no ransom notes. Just clean vanishings, as though the church had swallowed the children whole. The consistency of the cases should have been a red flag. It wasn't. Instead, the pattern was willfully ignored. It was easier, perhaps, to believe that the town was cursed or unlucky than to face the possibility of human involvement, especially from within a place that represented trust, sanctity, and God. But in hindsight, the willful blindness was almost surreal. By the time child number 6, Hannah Keller, disappeared in 1991, some families were desperate. Hannah's father, a former Marine, begged the police to investigate the clergy. He said Hannah had been acting fearful in the weeks leading up to Christmas, especially around one particular church figure. But when asked for specifics, Hannah hadn't said much. He said I should never tell, she once whispered. After her disappearance, her father's pleas were dismissed as emotional overreaction. There's no proof of wrongdoing, the church insisted. Yet more evidence of a pattern continued to emerge. Several of the missing children had previously reported strange occurrences at the church, uncomfortable encounters, secret meetings after hours, or being called to special duties no one else seemed to know about. But each time a family member brought these up, they were met with the same tired responses. Kids make things up. It was probably just a misunderstanding. Let's not jump to conclusions. The truth is, no one wanted to believe something evil could exist inside a holy place. Churches are supposed to be sanctuaries, not crime scenes. But by refusing to investigate the obvious connections, authorities enabled the disappearances to continue. There was also the fear of backlash. The clergy held immense power. The town's mayor was a devout Catholic who had been baptized at St. Anselm's. The chief of police attended daily mass. Several members of the city council were tied to the church through family, business, or political alliances. Pointing a finger at St. Anselm's wasn't just dangerous. It was practically career suicide. As a result, the pattern was hidden in plain sight, and more children suffered because of it. Years later, investigative journalists and independent researchers would revisit the case, stunned by the refusal to act. They uncovered internal memos suggesting that church leadership was aware of potential inappropriate conduct as early as 1988, but had chosen to handle it internally with no law enforcement notification. In many ways, the real tragedy isn't just that 11 children vanished. It's that they didn't have to. If the first disappearance had been taken more seriously, or if the second had triggered a full-scale investigation, perhaps the pattern could have been stopped in its tracks. Instead, institutional fear, political cowardice, and blind faith created the perfect storm for evil to thrive. The community didn't just fail to see the pattern, they actively chose not to. To this day, no one has been held responsible, and the official stance remains frustratingly vague. There is no conclusive link between the cases, one former sheriff said in a 2004 interview, but for the families of the missing, the pattern is obvious, painfully obvious. They gather every Christmas Eve, not to celebrate, but to hold candles outside the now abandoned church. Silent witnesses to the truth no one wanted to face. The community didn't just fail to see the pattern, they actively chose not to. To this day, no one has been held responsible, and the official stance remains frustratingly vague. There is no conclusive link between the cases, one former sheriff said in a 2004 interview, But for the families of the missing, the pattern is obvious, painfully obvious. They gather every Christmas Eve, not to celebrate, but to hold candles outside the now abandoned church, silent witnesses to the truth no one wanted to face. Missing children associated with St. Anselm's Church grew from the first disappearance in 1987 to the 11th by 1992. So too did the anxiety and desperation of the families left behind. But what disturbed the town more than the disappearances themselves was the strange silence from the very institution at the center of it all, the church. St. Anselm's wasn't just a building. It was a pillar of the community. For decades, its priests had baptized children, presided over weddings, and buried loved ones. People trusted the church not just spiritually, but socially, which is why the lack of transparency from its leaders following the disappearances felt like betrayal. When Daniel Whitaker, the first child to vanish, disappeared during midnight mass in 1987, the church issued a brief statement expressing sympathy and support for the family. Father Malcolm James, the presiding priest at the time, offered prayers during the following Sunday service, but stopped short of taking any personal responsibility or suggesting anything unusual might have happened inside the church. He refused interviews and declined to meet with Daniel's parents privately. At first, no one thought much of it. After all, priests weren't detectives. What could they really say? But when the second and third disappearances occurred under near identical circumstances, the church's pattern of cold distance and bureaucratic evasion became impossible to ignore. One grieving father, Miguel Alvarez, whose daughter Maria disappeared in 1989, publicly accused the church of hiding something. In a tearful statement to reporters, he said, "My daughter disappeared while working for the church. In the church. And they won't even speak to us. No answers. No apology. Just silence and prayers. It's not enough anymore." That statement sparked a wave of public unrest, but instead of addressing the growing concerns directly, the church tightened its walls. Journalists were denied access to midnight mass. Church staff were instructed not to speak to the press. The parish council issued a formal letter to the congregation discouraging wild speculation and urging people to focus on faith and healing rather than division and blame. But to the community, this read like damage control, not compassion. People were asking questions and they weren't getting answers. Why were no surveillance systems ever installed, even after multiple disappearances? Why did the church never launch its own investigation or hire private security? Why were certain rooms in the church, including the lower crypt, reportedly locked and inaccessible, even to police without diocesan approval? One local reporter, Angela Ferris, who covered the case for the Millfield Tribune, recalled being denied entry to church records and even being followed after asking questions about the layout of the building. They said they had nothing to hide, she wrote in an editorial. But the more I pushed, the more doors closed, literally and figuratively. And yet the silence persisted. Privately, some parishioners began voicing suspicions. Several recalled seeing members of the clergy behaving oddly in the weeks surrounding each disappearance, hastily canceled meetings, whispered hallway conversations, and uncharacteristically nervous homilies. A few even claimed to have seen young altar servers being called into the rectory alone at late hours, though no one could prove wrongdoing. The church's handling of public memorials also raised eyebrows. Families who wanted to install commemorative plaques, hold candlelight vigils on church grounds, or speak during services were quietly discouraged or outright denied. Instead, the church focused on broader messages of hope, God's plan, and trust in divine mystery, words that rang hollow to grieving parents desperate for real action. Things reached a breaking point in 1992 after the 11th disappearance. A group of parents attempted to hold a press conference on church steps during Christmas week, calling for the resignation of Father Malcolm James and a full audit of the church's activities. They were met by private security hired by the diocese, who informed them that church property was off limits for unauthorized gatherings. The event was relocated to a nearby park in freezing temperatures, where shaken parents stood before cameras, clutching photographs of their missing children, while the stone silhouette of St. Anselm's loomed behind them. The church's official response? A single press release from the Archdiocese that read in part, "We grieve alongside the community and continue to offer our deepest prayers. However, the church cannot be held liable for tragic events that are outside of its knowledge or control. We ask that the public refrain from harmful speculation during this holy season." To many, this was the final insult, a deliberate deflection cloaked in religious language, designed to shut down discussion rather than open it. The silence wasn't just indifference, it became its own kind of violence. Over time, whispers turned to theories, and theories turned to paranoia. Some believed the church was covering up abuse. Others feared something more esoteric occult activity, secret tunnels, hidden rituals. A few locals insisted they had seen strange lights in the bell tower late at night, long after the building was supposedly empty. One former maintenance worker anonymously claimed there were areas of the basement that were deliberately sealed off, but said he was threatened with legal action when he tried to speak to reporters. But with the church stonewalling investigators and the diocese refusing to comment, these stories remained just that, stories. There was never a smoking gun, never a confession, never an arrest. Instead, St. Anselm's grew quieter. Families left. The congregation shrank. Midnight Mass attendance dropped from hundreds to a handful. By the year 2000, the church discontinued the service entirely. And yet the building remained. Tall, cold, silent. To this day, no one from the church leadership during the years of the disappearances has ever been charged, deposed, or even questioned publicly. Most have either retired, moved, or died. The diocese maintains the position that there was no direct link between the disappearances and the church. But ask the families or the townspeople who lived through it, and they'll tell you a different story. They'll tell you silence is sometimes louder than a scream. For years, the silence surrounding the disappearances at St. Anselm's Church was deafening. 11 children, each one last seen during or after midnight Mass, had vanished without explanation between 1987 and 1992. There were no witnesses, no evidence, and no arrests. The town grieved in cycles. Rumors circulated. Trust in the church shattered. But still, nothing changed. Until 1993, when one voice finally broke through the silence, a young man who had narrowly escaped becoming the 12th victim. His name was Evan McCauley, and he had once been an altar boy at St. Anselm's, serving regularly between 1990 and 1992, the peak years of the disappearances. When he came forward at the age of 17, Evan was no longer the shy, obedient child who had once knelt beside the altar. He had grown into a pale, withdrawn teenager, haunted by something he couldn't unsee or forget. At first, his claims were brushed off. Trauma, some said. Delusions brought on by grief and fear. But the details he shared and the timing were too precise to ignore. Evan hadn't told anyone his story at the time because, as he put it, I didn't know if it was real or if it was something evil playing with my head. According to Evan, something deeply unsettling had been happening behind the scenes of midnight Mass for years. and it was orchestrated by those who were supposed to protect the children. In a taped interview with a local journalist, Evan recounted a chilling memory from December 1991, when he was just 14 years old and preparing to serve Mass with two other boys, Milo Jensen and Kevin Doyle, both of whom would vanish that night. As Evan recalled, we'd done rehearsals earlier that week and everything seemed normal. Father Bell said we'd be helping with communion and incense. Nothing unusual. But the night of the Mass, something was off. The priests weren't their usual selves. They were whispering a lot, looking at us strangely. And one of them, I'll never forget this. He told me I'd be sitting this one out at the last minute. No explanation. That man was Father Marcus, one of the younger priests at the time, and someone Evan had always felt uneasy around. Evan was instructed to stay in the vestry, a small side room connected to the sacristy, and wait until further notice. The other two boys, Milo and Kevin, proceeded to the altar to perform their duties. They never came back, Evan said. But it wasn't just their disappearance that haunted him. It was what he saw or thought he saw while he waited. I heard singing, he explained. Not the choir, something deeper, older. It wasn't Latin like we were taught. It sounded almost wrong, like chanting, but in a different tongue. I know that sounds insane, but it wasn't part of the service. It came from beneath the floor. Evan claimed he heard muffled footsteps behind the church walls and voices speaking in hushed tones, one of which he swore was Father Bell's, the head priest. Then, without warning, the candle in the vestry blew out, despite no open windows or air vents. I felt cold. Then I heard someone say my name from the other side of the door, except it was Milo's voice, only it didn't sound like him anymore. Terrified, Evan barricaded the door and waited until morning, too afraid to leave. When he was finally discovered by a cleaning volunteer the next day, he was pale, shivering, and unable to explain what had happened. He told his parents he'd gotten lost and fallen asleep. That was easier than trying to explain what he felt and what he suspected. In the following months, Evan became increasingly withdrawn. He quit the altar boy program. He avoided the church entirely. Nightmares plagued him, most of them involving candlelit tunnels, hollow voices, and children crying from behind stone wall. What finally pushed him to come forward was guilt. For years, he carried the belief that he was supposed to be taken that night, too, that something had marked him, and for some reason, changed its mind. His public testimony in 1993 shook the town. Though many dismissed it as trauma-induced hallucinations, others especially, the families of the missing, saw something deeper in his words, the first thread of truth in a web of lies. Authorities were pressured to reopen the investigation. The church refused to comment. Father Marcus had been transferred to another diocese in 1992 and could not be reached. Father Bell, who had retired shortly after the final disappearance, issued only one statement through a lawyer. The allegations are unfounded and based on fantasy. I pray for all involved. But Evan's story opened a floodgate. Other former altar boys began to step forward, not with stories as extreme, but with small, unnerving recollections, unexplained bruises, strange instructions during services, forbidden rooms beneath the rectory, and clergy members who gave them unsettling attention. No physical evidence ever surfaced to back Evans' claims, and without it, law enforcement closed the case again within months. But to many, his testimony was the missing puzzle piece, a survivor's account that finally made sense of the senseless. Years later, Evan would give one final interview before vanishing from public life entirely. He ended it with a chilling statement. People think I'm crazy for saying what I saw, but I didn't imagine it. Something was happening in that church, something we weren't supposed to see. And I don't know if it was evil people or something even worse. All I know is this: the kids didn't just vanish. They were taken, and someone or something knew exactly when and how to do it. Evan's account remains the only first-hand narrative tied to the St. Anselm's disappearances. And while skeptics continue to doubt him, others, especially the families left behind, still cling to the hope that his words hold the key to finally understanding what happened to the midnight mass kids. As the years stretched on, the chilling disappearances at St. Anselm's Church began to fade from national attention, but they never faded from the lives of those left behind. 11 children, ages 8 to 13, vanished without a trace during or just after midnight mass services between 1987 and 1992. No bodies were ever recovered. No arrests were made. No convictions. Only the questions remained, and they grew louder in the silence. By the mid-90s, the town that once gathered joyfully for Christmas Eve celebrations had become a place haunted by grief and suspicion. The doors of St. Anselm's Church still opened every December 24th, but the pews were no longer full. Where there had once been singing laughter and children playing in the aisles, now there was only tension and fear. Parents refused to let their kids near the altar. Candlelight vigils replaced the old holiday processions, and every year as the date approached, the mood in town turned somber. The disappearances weren't simply unsolved crimes. They were wounds that refused to close. For the families of the missing children, the pain remained fresh. Some stayed in town, unable to leave the last place they saw their sons or daughters alive. Others moved away, trying to escape the weight of empty bedrooms and unwrapped Christmas gifts. But they all carried the same burden, the unbearable uncertainty of not knowing. What's often overlooked in stories like this is what it means to live without closure. No evidence, no grave, no finality. For Elaine Whitaker, mother of the first child who vanished, 9-year-old Daniel, that uncertainty was a curse worse than death. If he had died in an accident, I'd mourn him. I'd bury him. But this, I don't know if he's dead. I don't know if he's suffering. I don't know if he's still out there waiting for me to find him. How do you move on from that? In 1997, a group of the parents formed the Midnight 11 Foundation, a nonprofit dedicated to investigating the disappearances independently. They hired private detectives, funded psychological profiles, and even brought in psychics, though few admitted that publicly. One investigator, retired NYPD Detective Sal Marino, reviewed the case files and offered this grim assessment. The fact that all these kids vanished during the same church service, in the same building, over multiple years, tells me this wasn't random. It wasn't some fluke or coincidence. Someone was taking them, and they knew the church well. Despite these efforts, leads dried up. Witnesses grew older or passed away. Key clergy members retired, transferred, or became unreachable. Father Marcus, a central figure in multiple accusations, was found dead of a stroke in 2001. He had never spoken publicly about the events at St. Anselm's. With each passing year, the possibility of a resolution seemed to shrink, and yet the haunting details of the case refused to let the story die. Theories persisted, especially online. Some believed the children were victims of a human trafficking ring, potentially involving insiders at the church who knew the building's layout and schedules. Others suggested the involvement of a secret religious sect, using the church as a front. The most extreme theories delved into the occult, citing the timing of the disappearances always on Christmas Eve and the lone survivor's story of
underground chanting, and strange rituals. Still others wondered whether the church itself, the physical structure, hid something older, something darker. The building, erected in the late 1800s, had underground crypts and sealed chambers that had never been fully explored. During one brief investigation in 1994, a maintenance crew discovered a bricked-off stairwell leading to a sub-basement that appeared to have been sealed decades earlier. Inside were broken pews, dust-covered hymnals, and something more chilling, a row of small robes, folded neatly, sized for children. The robes were tested, but DNA results were inconclusive due to degradation. No charges followed. The chamber was resealed for safety reasons. That was the last official search conducted in St. Anselm's subterranean levels. To this day, that chamber and others like it remain inaccessible. As the 2000s came and went, the story of the midnight mass disappearances faded from headlines, but not from memory. Each year on Christmas Eve at exactly midnight, the families of the missing gather outside St. Anselm's Church, holding candles and photos of their children. They don't chant. They don't speak. They simply stand a living reminder of the town's darkest secret. In recent years, the case has seen a resurgence of interest, thanks in part to true crime documentaries and YouTube investigators. A 2021 podcast titled The Vanished 11 brought new attention to the inconsistencies in the church's statements and the shoddy handling of early investigations. The series sparked renewed calls for excavation of the church basement and its surrounding grounds calls that were once again denied by the current diocese. Why? Officials cited historical preservation, structural integrity risks, and respect for sacred spaces. But critics argue it's just another chapter in a long pattern of obstruction and silence. Some believe the truth will never come out. Others believe it already has, but no one in power is willing to acknowledge it. What remains is a mystery that still gnaws at the edges of faith, memory, and trust. A case so unsettling that it seems impossible. And yet it happened. 11 children, all gone, all connected to the same church, all taken, it seems, with care and with purpose. Today, the name Midnight Mass evokes something very different in the town of Fairhaven. Not reverence, not peace, but loss. And the most haunting question still remains. Why them? Why there? And how, after all this time, has no one answered for it?